I remember the coldness of the kitchen tiles pressing against my cheek as though the floor itself wanted to swallow me. My palms clawed at the smooth linoleum, searching for something, anything, as if air might be hiding in the cracks. My chest fought itself every second, each inhale stolen halfway, like a thief slipping out a back door. Above me stood Mark Dawson, the man who insisted on being called my father. Even though he never earned that right, his arms crossed tight across his chest, his lips curled into a smirk, a smile that was not joy but mockery, and his eyes cut down at me with the sharpness of someone who took pleasure in power. "You are fine. Stop pretending," he barked, his voice bouncing off the cabinets. My own lungs disagreed. My vision tunneled in the edges, shading black, as though the world itself was dimming the lights on me. I tried to speak to tell him I could not breathe, but my throat locked, and only a thin wheeze escaped, frightening even to my own ears. My mother, Linda, hovered near the counter with her phone still in her hand, her face frozen between disbelief and obedience. Mark gave her a look that was enough to keep her quiet, a silent command that chained her as effectively as if he had spoken out loud. She whispered, "She is just making a scene," and those words pierced worse than the lack of oxygen. My stepsister Rachel leaned against the doorway, holding her own phone up, ready to record me at my weakest moment. She laughed, a short, cruel sound that echoed around the kitchen like glass breaking. "She always does this when she wants attention," Rachel sneered, her voice dripping with the confidence of someone who had always been believed over me. Attention was the last thing I wanted. I wanted air. I wanted life. My head spun, the ceiling light fractured into streaks of painful brightness, and my body felt both heavy and hollow. I could sense my heartbeat racing too fast and then stumbling, each beat less certain than the one before. For a moment, I thought about every time Mark had pushed me into silence, every time Rachel had mocked my tears, every time my mother had chosen peace over truth. Now their choices circled above me like vultures. The smirk on Mark's face widened as he crouched closer, his voice a whisper just loud enough for me to hear. "Pathetic," he said, like the word was my name. My hands shook as I pressed them to my chest, trying to force my lungs to obey. The kitchen smelled faintly of the lemon cleaner my mother used that morning, but beneath it was something sharper, metallic, bitter. I wanted to believe it was my imagination, yet every breath made me gag harder. My body refused to cooperate. My lips tinged blue, and I realized with a clarity that terrified me my heart was struggling. I was 18 years old, and I could feel my own life slipping through my fingers on the kitchen floor. The cruel irony was that the people who were supposed to protect me were standing above me, dismissing me, even enjoying the sight. Rachel's laughter pricked at my ears like pins. My mother's silence felt like betrayal made flesh. And Mark's smirk, that smug expression carved into his face, became the last image burning into my mind. My chest tightened again, a wave of pain rolling through me so fierce that tears spilled from the corners of my eyes. I thought, is this how it ends? Gasping like a fish on the floor of the house I never felt safe in, with my mother looking away and my stepfather mocking me. I reached out one trembling hand toward the glass on the counter, the last thing I had touched before my body revolted. My fingers grazed the cool edge and then slipped. The glass toppled, hit the floor, and shattered pieces scattering around me like frozen raindrops. The sound made Rachel jump back for a second before she smirked again, raising her phone higher, recording not to save me, but to humiliate me. The taste in my mouth grew stranger, heavier, and in the fog of my collapsing vision, I thought I understood that something more sinister than asthma or panic was happening. Something was wrong with what I had just consumed. My voice caught, unable to rise louder than a whisper, and all I could manage was a broken cry. "Please." Nobody bent down. Nobody touched me. Nobody offered comfort. Instead, Mark straightened up, shrugged, and said, "She will get up when she wants to." And in that instant, I realized the most horrifying truth of my short life. They did not care if I survived. My body arched with another desperate gasp, and I could feel my heart stumble, skipping as though it had forgotten its rhythm. The words rattled through my mind. My heart stopped, and for a fleeting second I wondered if this was the moment my story would end. But somewhere beyond the kitchen door, faint and almost lost under the ringing in my ears, I heard the sound of tires screeching, a door slamming, and heavy boots striking tile. That was the sound of interruption. That was the sound of chance. And yet, in that kitchen on that cold floor, staring up at the smirk of the man who wanted me silent, I was not sure if help had come in time. The truth about what happened that night did not begin with the glass of water. It began years earlier when my mother remarried. I was only 13 when she met Mark Dawson at a church barbecue in Springfield. At first, he appeared charming, a man with steady work managing a local auto garage on the west side of town, someone who could provide stability for a single mother raising 2 girls. My mother, Linda, had been a nurse for almost 20 years, working long hours at Memorial Medical Center, and she was tired of shouldering responsibility alone. Mark made her laugh. He carried her groceries to the car, and he told her she deserved to be taken care of. That was what she wanted to hear, and within a year, she had invited him into our home. What followed was not stability, but a slow tightening of control that none of us could admit to at first. Mark moved in with an air of ownership. He started with small things, rearranging the furniture, insisting we eat dinner at exactly 6 o'clock. Then he began commenting on what I wore, telling me skirts were too short or sweaters too baggy. By the time I was 15, his authority filled the house like smoke. My mother, who once argued fiercely with anyone at work, began to nod quickly when he spoke, her voice soft around him. It frightened me, but I told myself she was just tired of fighting. Rachel, my stepsister, was 2 years older than me, and she adored him from the beginning. He bought her a used Honda when she turned 16, bragged to everyone about how proud he was, and let her skip chores without consequence. With me, it was the opposite. He scrutinized my grades, demanded to see my paycheck when I got a part-time job, and reminded me daily that everything in the house was his. By the time I was 18, the balance of power was clear. My mother depended on Mark financially, even though she earned a nurse's salary, because he had convinced her to pool everything into a joint account that he controlled. He decided how bills were paid, how much money she could use for groceries, and whether I deserved any allowance. I worked evenings at a small cafe called Beans Corner on Monroe Street. I loved the cafe because it smelled of roasted beans and cinnamon, and the owner, Mrs. Carter, treated me with more kindness than I ever found at home. My wages were modest, just enough to save for community college, but Mark demanded I hand over cash every week for what he called household expenses. Whenever I protested, he leaned in close and said, "You want a roof, don't you?" My mother never intervened. Rachel joined in his mockery. She had enrolled at the University of Illinois in Chicago, but spent weekends at home flaunting her new clothes that Mark paid for. She called me Cinderella when she passed me scrubbing the counters, except in her story there was no fairy godmother waiting to rescue me. She captured pictures of me after long shifts when my apron still smelled of coffee and my eyes were rimmed red from fatigue, and she sent them to friends with captions like "Drama Queen at it again." Those friends laughed at me when they visited, never offering a hand, always echoing her tone. Each insult was another stone in the wall they built around me. In the weeks before the incident, the tension grew sharper. I had been accepted to Lincoln Land Community College in Springfield and planned to start in the fall. I kept a folder under my bed filled with forms, scholarship applications, and a list of textbooks. Mark discovered it one night when he barged into my room without knocking. He thumbed through the papers, then tossed them onto the bed. "Waste of money," he said. "You are not leaving this house until I decide." My mother stood in the doorway wringing her hands. She whispered maybe she can commute, but Mark silenced her with a glare. I lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, heart pounding, realizing my future might not belong to me at all. The day everything changed began like so many others. It was a humid August evening in Springfield. The air was heavy with the scent of cut grass and gasoline from the garage down the street. I worked a closing shift at Beans Corner, wiping counters and stacking chairs, while Mrs. Carter counted the till. She slipped me a free blueberry muffin, smiling gently, and told me to keep my head up. I clutched it like treasure on the walk home. By the time I reached our 2-story house on Walnut Street, the sky was deep purple and cicadas sang loud from the trees. I stepped inside, quietly hoping to make it to my room unnoticed, but Mark's voice called from the kitchen. "Emily, come here." He was standing by the counter in his work shirt, grease still smudged on the sleeves. My mother sat at the table scrolling through her phone, her face pale under the overhead light. Rachel leaned against the fridge, her hair perfectly curled, eyes glinting with amusement. I swallowed, sensing the familiar setup of an ambush. Mark gestured to a glass of water waiting on the counter. "Drink," he ordered. I hesitated. Something in his tone sent a chill across my skin. But Rachel crossed her arms, smirking, and said, "What are you scared of? It is just water." My throat was dry from walking in the heat, and against my better instinct, I lifted the glass. The first sip tasted odd, faintly bitter metallic, like when you bite your tongue. I frowned but swallowed again. Rachel laughed softly. My mother looked down at her phone, refusing to meet my eyes. Within minutes, the unease in my stomach sharpened. My chest grew tight and a cold sweat slid down my temples. I tried to speak to ask if anyone else tasted it, but my words tangled. My legs weakened and I sank to the floor, clutching my chest. The glass slipped from my hand and clattered water splashing across the tiles. Rachel gasped dramatically and then burst into laughter. "She is always like this when she wants attention," she said, her voice high and cruel. Mark's smirk appeared again. He did not move to help, did not even lean down. He simply folded his arms and said, "Stop pretending." My mother's lips parted, but she shut them quickly, staring at her phone as if the glowing screen could shield her from the scene unfolding at her feet. I felt my heartbeat hammer erratically, each thud weaker, and panic flared through me. I wanted to scream, but my lungs betrayed me. I wanted to run, but my body pinned itself to the floor. Rachel's laughter filled the kitchen like static. She raised her phone, recording me as if my suffering was a spectacle for her entertainment. This was the dynamic of my family boiled down into one cruel tableau. Mark controlling my mother, complicit, Rachel mocking. And me, the girl on the floor, denied even the dignity of being believed. Every humiliation of the past years funneled into that moment. Every stolen paycheck, every slammed door, every insult. The weight of their disregard pressed on me heavier than the lack of air. The bitter taste on my tongue grew sharper. My chest convulsed. The world tilted as though the floor itself slid out from under me. I thought fleetingly of the cafe, of Mrs. Carter's kind eyes, of the acceptance letter I had hidden under my mattress. Those small symbols of hope seemed to drift away like balloons snapping from their strings. As I gasped, my ears filled with the sound of Rachel's giggle, Mark's disdainful sigh, and my mother's silence. My heart stumbled in its rhythm, and I realized with terror that something inside me was shutting down. The realization cut deeper than any insult. They were watching me fade, and not one of them cared enough to lift a hand. That was the night I understood exactly how toxic my family had become, and that was the night the mask of normalcy finally tore away. The sound that broke through the haze of my gasps did not come from anyone in my family. It came from outside, a sharp slam of a car door and the heavy rhythm of boots against pavement. At first, I thought it was my imagination, the strange music of a dying brain, but then the kitchen door swung open with force that rattled the frame. A man stepped in his uniform dark against the yellow glow of our kitchen light. EMT was printed across his chest, and his radio hissed at his shoulder. His eyes landed on me instantly, ignoring the others as though they were shadows. Jason Miller. I would later learn his name crouched down beside me, and his gloved hands tilted my chin gently upward. He looked into my eyes with the precision of someone trained to measure how much life remained. His expression shifted fast from professional calm to concern to something harder like steel drawn from fire. "Pulse is weak, respiration shallow," he muttered more to himself than to anyone else. My lips quivered around the oxygen that refused to come. He reached into his bag, pulled out a mask, and pressed it over my face. A hiss of clean air burst into my nose and mouth, and for a moment it burned like fire, then softened into a wave that filled my lungs deeper than anything had in minutes. My hands clutched the mask as if it might vanish. His other hand clipped a device to my finger, and numbers flickered on a small screen. His jaw tightened. "Pulse ox is low," he said into his radio, oxygen improving but unstable. Behind him, Mark scoffed. "She is fine," he declared with a laugh that rang false. "She just likes to cause drama." Jason did not even glance up. Instead, he leaned closer to me, his voice low but firm. "Stay with me," he said. His tone was unlike anything I had heard in that house. It was steady, commanding, protective. It was the sound of someone who believed me. Tears blurred my eyes and slid down my temples. For the first time that night, I felt the faintest thread of safety. But then, Jason's gaze flicked to the broken glass on the floor beside me. His hand, quick and subtle, slipped a small bag from his kit, and he used a swab to collect something from the rim. He sealed it, tucked it away, and gave the briefest nod to the police officer who had entered just behind him. The officer uniform, neat eyes scanning the room with precision, caught the gesture and moved closer. "Backup needed possible poisoning," Jason murmured into his radio, his words almost drowned by the crackle of static. The kitchen air thickened with tension. Mark's face flushed red. He barked, "This is ridiculous! She probably just choked on her own spit." Rachel's smirk faltered for the first time, her phone slipping lower in her hand. My mother's hands shook around her cell phone, her lips pressed tight as if she wanted to vanish. Jason finally looked up, his voice calm but razor-sharp. "She is not fine," he said, "and I think you know why." The officer stepped forward, his hand resting casually near his belt, his tone polite but edged with authority. "Sir, step back." Mark laughed again, but the sound cracked at the edges. He muttered something about kids these days, but his eyes darted toward the evidence bag Jason had sealed. I lay on the floor, breathing through the mask, my chest still rattling, and I watched the shift in power I had never seen before. For years, Mark commanded every room he entered. Now, a man in uniform with calm eyes was telling him to stand aside, and for once he had no immediate answer. The officer knelt down next to Jason. "What do we have?" he asked. Jason kept his voice steady. "Severe respiratory distress, altered consciousness, possible ingestion. Evidence collected. Need talk screen." The officer's eyes flicked to the broken glass, then to my face, pale and damp with sweat. He nodded once and spoke quietly into his radio. "Dispatch, we are going to need police backup at this location. Possible domestic poisoning." The words sliced through the kitchen air like a blade. Poisoning! My heart jolted at the sound. Until that moment, part of me still believed I was weak, dramatic, that maybe Mark was right. But hearing a professional say it out loud gave shape to the terror in my chest. My body was not failing me by accident. Something had been done to me. The truth curled cold around my spine. Mark exploded. "This is outrageous! You cannot just accuse me in my own home!" His voice thundered against the walls. But the officer remained calm, his eyes steady. "Sir, step back now." Rachel tried to laugh again, but it came out brittle. She said she always makes a fuss, she just wants attention, but her tone lacked its usual confidence. Her hands twisted around her phone. My mother finally spoke, her voice sharp with panic. "What are you talking about?" "She is fine." But Jason cut her off with the firmness of someone who had heard too many lies. "She is not fine." Through the haze of my vision, I saw the faint strobe of red and blue lights splash across the window as another patrol car arrived. The sirens did not wail. They purred low, almost hidden like predators circling. My breath shuddered under the mask oxygen, filling me with a strange mixture of relief and fear. Relief because I could breathe again. Fear because I now understood I was not just sick. I was a victim. Jason leaned close again, his voice softer this time, almost too gentle for the room. "Stay with me," he whispered. "We are not letting this get covered up." His words pierced through the fog, and I clung to them. Covered up. The phrase rang in my head, jagged and loud. He knew. He saw. He was telling me, without saying it outright, that the truth had teeth and it would not be buried. The officer straightened, turning to my mother. "Ma'am, we will need you to step into the other room." His tone was still polite, but there was no space for refusal. My mother's mouth opened as though to argue, but the steel in his eyes silenced her. She rose stiffly, her phone still clutched, and moved toward the doorway. Rachel hissed, "This is ridiculous," but when the officer repeated "ma'am" sharper this time, she fell silent. I watched them through the fog of oxygen and dim vision, my breath still ragged but steadier than before. They did not see me watching. They did not see Jason discreetly slip another evidence bag toward the officer, something he had picked up near the sink. The officer glanced inside and his jaw tightened. He whispered something I could not hear, but Jason's answering nod confirmed everything. This was no accident. The realization spread through me colder than the tile beneath my body. I was not simply fighting to breathe. I was fighting to stay alive in a house that had become more dangerous than any street. My family had not only dismissed me, they had nearly erased me. Every second of disbelief, every cruel laugh, every smirk now fell into place as pieces of a puzzle too horrifying to deny. Jason adjusted the mask, his eyes kind but unyielding. "You are safe now," he murmured. I wanted to believe him, but the weight of years under Mark's control told me safety was not a promise easily kept. Yet in that moment, as the oxygen hissed and the lights flashed faintly outside, I allowed a spark of trust to take root. It was the first crack in the wall that had imprisoned me for years. The officer radioed again, his voice calm and steady. "We are transporting the patient to Memorial Medical Center. Protective custody requested. Repeat, protective custody." Those words lodged in my chest as another twist. Protective custody. The phrase carried a gravity that said they saw the danger was not over when I left the house. They understood that the threat lived under the same roof as me. As Jason and the officer lifted me gently onto a stretcher, the mask still strapped over my face, I looked sideways at the figures of my family. Mark's face was twisted with rage, his jaw tight as though he wanted to shout but held back by the presence of uniforms. Rachel's smirk had drained away, replaced by an uneasy twitch. My mother clutched her phone like it could save her, her lips whispering frantic words I could not hear. For the first time, they were not in control. The stretcher wheels bumped against the threshold as they carried me toward the waiting ambulance. The night air struck cool against my damp skin, and I inhaled through the mask with greedy lungs. The street was lined with neighbors' houses, windows lit with curious silhouettes. Some faces peeked out from porches, murmurs rippling through the quiet block. In Springfield, where gossip traveled faster than wind, this scene would not stay hidden. A girl carried out of her own home under flashing lights, her stepfather raging at the edge of the driveway, police officers standing guard. Inside the ambulance, Jason stayed by my side, adjusting the mask and speaking into his radio. He kept his voice calm, measured, though I saw the tightness in his jaw that betrayed his fury. The officer rode in the front seat, his hand resting lightly near his holster, scanning the road ahead as though danger could still emerge. Every bump in the road rattled my ribs, every turn made my stomach lurch, but the steady flow of oxygen anchored me. My vision cleared enough to see Jason's determined expression, the kind that told me he had no intention of letting this slip away as just another medical call. As Memorial Medical Center drew closer, I realized with a mixture of dread and relief that this was no longer a private family matter. It was now a case, an investigation, a truth that would not be hidden behind closed doors. The smirk Mark wore in the kitchen no longer owned me. The laughter Rachel spilled across my pain no longer defined me. My mother's silence no longer erased me. The men in uniforms, the lights flashing against the dark Illinois sky, the evidence bags sealed tight, they all told a different story. My story. One that had only just begun to be spoken. The ambulance roared across the quiet streets of Springfield, every bump a sharp reminder that my body was fragile and unsteady. The oxygen mask hissed rhythmically, a mechanical breath that replaced the ones I had lost. Jason kept his gaze fixed on me, his hands moving quickly as he checked the monitor attached to my finger, his voice low into the radio updating the hospital. His calm was not the kind of false calm my family used, the kind that silenced truth, but a professional steadiness that carried urgency beneath it. I clung to that steadiness as the wheels turned beneath us. The officer in the front seat spoke quietly into his own radio, confirming that protective custody was in place. That phrase repeated in my mind until it carved itself into my thoughts. They were protecting me not from strangers, but from my own home. When the ambulance doors swung open at Memorial Medical Center, fluorescent lights flooded my vision. The air inside was cool and sharp, disinfectant mingling with the metallic tang that still lingered on my tongue. Nurses in scrubs surrounded me, voices quick and efficient, hands adjusting wires and cuffs. Jason guided them, repeating my vitals, explaining what he had seen in the kitchen. Possible ingestion, he said again, evidence collected at the scene. His words carried weight, and I watched as the attending physician's expression darkened with comprehension. They wheeled me into an exam room where machines beeped steadily and the scent of antiseptic hung thick. Dr. Karen Mitchell entered, her white coat crisp, her face controlled but intent. She reviewed the monitor, flipped through the initial chart, and then looked directly at me. "We are running a toxicology screen," she said evenly, her voice professional but gentle. "Do you remember what you ate or drank in the last hour?" My throat ached, but I forced the words past the dryness. "Just water," I whispered from the glass on the counter. Jason and the officer exchanged a look that said more than words. "That glass is evidence," Jason confirmed quietly. Dr. Mitchell nodded once and turned to order the labs. As blood was drawn from my arm, the cold sting of the needle barely registered compared to the weight of dread pressing on me. I stared at the ceiling tiles patterned in sterile white squares, each one a reminder that I was in a place where truth could not be brushed aside. My chest still trembled with every breath, but oxygen flowed deeper now enough to realize that this was no mistake. The bitter taste, the burning lungs, the collapse on the kitchen floor, all of it pointed to something intentional. Through the open doorway, I caught sight of my mother and Rachel in the waiting area. My mother leaned forward, speaking urgently into her phone, her face lined with panic that looked less like fear for me and more like fear of what others would think. Rachel sat slouched, scrolling through her phone with forced nonchalance, her leg bouncing nervously. They looked out of place under the hospital's harsh lights, two figures caught in a web of their own making, pretending nothing was wrong while everything was unraveling. The officer's radio crackled, and a voice came through, calm and unmistakable. Talk screen on the glass came back positive. Same compound found in the patient's blood sample. The officer's eyes met mine, steady and unflinching, and he spoke quietly. "Miss, this was not random." The words froze the air in the room. Not random. The floor of my memory shifted as though everything I had endured slid into alignment. Their smirks, their laughter, their dismissal. They had not only ignored me, they had delivered me into danger. Dr. Mitchell returned minutes later, holding a sheet of paper heavy with numbers. "Ethylene glycol," she said grimly. "It is a compound found in antifreeze. We are starting treatment immediately." Her voice was controlled, but I caught the undercurrent of restrained fury, the frustration of a doctor who had seen preventable harm too many times. My eyes widened. Antifreeze. I had read once that it was sweet-tasting to animals but deadly silent in its damage. I whispered, "That is poison." She nodded once. "Yes, it does not take much." Jason remained near the bed, his eyes steady on me. "You are safe. Here," he reminded, though his jaw tightened as if he could barely restrain his anger. The officer spoke again, his voice cutting through the hum of machines. "Ma'am," he said to me formally, "do you feel safe going home tonight?" The question hung in the air, heavy as iron. Safe. The word felt foreign, hollow, because the image that rose in my mind was of my mother's phone held like a shield. Rachel's smirk and Mark's smirk curling as my body collapsed. My silence must have been enough of an answer because the officer continued. "We are keeping you here for observation. Protective detail is already assigned." From the hallway came the shuffle of boots, the weight of authority pressing closer. 2 more officers had arrived, their presence filling the sterile corridors with the gravity of law. The thin walls of family excuses could not stand against that sound. For the first time, I felt the weight of justice shifting toward me instead of against me. But my mother's voice rose sharp and brittle as officers approached her. "She is making this up!" She shouted, her tone high and cracking like glass. "She always exaggerates." Her words carried the same rhythm of dismissal she had used my entire life. But now it rang false under fluorescent lights and professional stares. One officer repeated calmly, Ma'am, I need you to come with us. Rachel straightened confusion flickering across her face until she saw me watching from the room. Her lips formed a single word, you. The venom in it told me everything. She was not afraid of my collapse. She was afraid of my survival. The officers led them down the hallway, their voices sharp but useless against the weight of evidence. The door to my room closed with a soft click and silence fell like a blanket. For the first time in years, their words did not cling to me like chains. The machines beeped steadily at my bedside, each tone proof that my body still fought. Dr. Mitchell sat beside me, laying the printout on the tray table. Do you know how this could have gotten into your system? My eyes dropped to the paper lines of numbers I could not interpret, but one word stared back at me positive. I swallowed, my voice trembling. I drank water. At the kitchen table. My mom made it. He nodded once, writing something down his face unreadable. I am obligated to tell you this was deliberate. The word deliberate pierced deeper than any diagnosis. It was not an accident, not neglect, but intent. Detective Carla Rodriguez entered her badge, glinting her voice calm but firm. We will be questioning them separately. Your home is secured. You will not be returning tonight. Relief and grief tangled in my chest. The thought of my little box of belongings, my clothes, my books, the acceptance folder under my mattress, all of it flashed in my mind. Yet there was no sorrow, only release. The walls that had caged me no longer defined me. Then the door opened slightly and a man stepped in. His dark coat brushed against the frame, gray hair dusting his temples. It was my Uncle Thomas Whitaker, my mother's older brother, the one who had once warned me quietly to keep a bag packed just in case. He walked to the table without greeting, placing a set of car keys on the tray. You are not going back, he said simply. I will make sure of it. His voice carried the kind of finality I had longed to hear my whole life. My shoulders lowered for the first time all day, and I let out a breath that was not stolen, not mocked, but mine. Outside in the corridor, I could hear officers speaking radios, crackling the machinery of justice grinding forward. By morning, the story would no longer belong to our kitchen. It would spread through official channels, through labs and reports, through charges written on paper. A detective returned with a folder and opened it for me. Photographs spilled across the pages. The tea mug on the table, the container on the counter, the residue inside the sink drain. Evidence physical and undeniable stared back at me. He spoke calmly. They are not admitting to anything, but the lab results are solid. This will move forward whether they cooperate or not. I clutched the hospital blanket, its thin fabric more comforting than anything from home. The family I had defended in whispers, the home I thought I belonged to, both were gone. Yet in their place stood proof professionals and a path forward. My uncle returned with a bag heavy with the sound of zippers and metal. Everything you need to get started, he said. Inside were clothes, a prepaid phone, and a folded lease agreement. Paid in full for 6 months. Do not thank me. Just promise me you will not go back. That promise was the only thing I could keep. Later, when I stood near the hospital's glass doors bag over my shoulder, the night air felt different. Lighter, cleaner, as if the poison clinging to my lungs had lifted from the very air around me. My uncle's car waited at the curb headlights, slicing through darkness. Across the street behind yellow tape that now wrapped around my childhood home stood 2 familiar figures. My mother's arms were crossed tight. Rachel's eyes were red, not with guilt, but with rage. I did not wave. I did not speak. I turned away, letting the door shut behind me. For the first time, silence was not suffocation. It was freedom. The first night outside my mother's house felt unreal, as though I had been pulled from one world and dropped into another without warning. The ride from Memorial Medical Center to Peoria was silent except for the hum of the tires on the interstate. My Uncle Thomas drove with both hands steady on the wheel, his eyes focused forward, his jaw set in determination. I sat in the passenger seat, clutching the bag he had given me, the lease agreement folded neatly inside the prepaid phone, heavy in my pocket. The oxygen mask was gone now, but the phantom hiss of its rhythm still echoed in my ears. My chest ached with each breath, but the air was mine again, not filtered through dismissal or mockery. The highway lights passed in even intervals, each one marking the distance between me and the house that had almost become my grave. When we reached his apartment in Peoria, a modest two-bedroom above a barber shop on Main Street, he carried my bag up the narrow staircase and unlocked the door. The space smelled faintly of old wood and coffee. He flipped on the lights and gestured toward the small guest room. "It is not much," he said, "but it is safe." Safe. That word settled over me like a blanket. I sat on the edge of the bed, its quilt simple but clean, and realized how long it had been since I had thought of any place as safe. My uncle left me to rest, and for the first time in years, I slept without straining my ears for footsteps in the hallway. Morning came with sunlight filtering through thin curtains. I woke to the sound of Thomas brewing coffee in the kitchen. My throat was still raw and my body weak, but I rose slowly and followed the smell. He handed me a mug, the steam curling upward, and sat across from me at the small table. His eyes softened for the first time since the hospital. "You are not going back there." He repeated, his voice firm but gentle. I nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. He slid the prepaid phone across the table. "Keep everything they send you," he instructed. "Messages, voicemails, anything. Do not answer. Just save. It will help." That day, the calls began. The phone buzzed with numbers I did not recognize, blocked IDs, unknown area codes. I let them go to voicemail. When I pressed play, the voices of my past spilled out. Rachel first, her tone dripping with anger. "You ruined everything. Mom is a wreck. I hope you are happy." Then, Mark, his voice low and dangerous even through the recording. "You are ungrateful. We gave you a home and you betray us. You will regret this." Then my mother, softer, almost pleading. "Come home and we will talk. You are making this worse than it is." I listened in silence, my heart thudding each word, both familiar and foreign. Familiar because it was the rhythm of control I had known my whole life. Foreign because now I was hearing it from a place they could not reach. That night, Thomas showed me how to save the recordings, how to back them up. He was a retired police officer, and his movements carried the precision of habit. He reminded me that words could be as valuable as fingerprints in building a case. I realized then that survival was not only about breathing, but about gathering truth piece by piece until the lies could not stand. Days passed in a blur of rest and paperwork. I met with Detective Rodriguez in Peoria, her questions steady and respectful. She assured me that the investigation was moving forward. Evidence from the house messages from Rachel, fingerprints on the container. Each piece stacked like bricks in a wall strong enough to shield me. My uncle drove me to the station and waited outside, every time his presence a silent anchor. But the threats escalated. One afternoon, the phone buzzed with a video file. I pressed play, and the screen lit with an image of my old bedroom. Every drawer pulled out, every shelf stripped bare. My books, my photographs, my clothes, gone. Then Rachel's face filled the screen. "Consider this your final wake-up call," she sneered before the camera cut off. I stared at the empty walls that had once held my small hopes, the posters and papers I had clung to, and felt a sharp pang. But then a strange calm settled over me. What she did not know was that I had already removed everything that mattered weeks before. Every important document, every piece of my real life was safe. Everything she destroyed was replaceable. I smiled for the first time in days. Because while she thought she was teaching me a lesson, what she had really done was expose herself further. The video, her sneer, her admission of destruction, all of it was more evidence. I saved the file and handed the phone to Detective Rodriguez the next day. She nodded with satisfaction, her pen scratching notes across the page. Each act of cruelty became another thread tying them tighter into their own trap. Meanwhile, I began to rebuild small routines. I walked down Main Street in Peoria, passing the barber shop, the corner store, the church with its tall white steeple. The neighborhood was quieter than Springfield, less familiar, but the people nodded politely when I passed. Some of them knew Thomas from years back and offered me kind words without asking questions. At the library, I used the computer to look up classes at Lincoln Land Community College, determined not to let Mark's sneer erase my future. For the first time, I allowed myself to imagine a life that belonged only to me. Yet nights remained difficult. I would lie awake in the small guest bed, shadows creeping across the walls, my heart racing whenever the phone buzzed. The fear of their voices reaching through the dark lingered. Sometimes I pressed play just to remind myself of the truth. Rachel's venom, Mark's rage, my mother's false softness. They were reminders of why I could not return, why safety was more than distance, why freedom was worth every pang of loneliness. Thomas never pushed me to talk, but when I did, he listened without judgment. He told me stories from his years on the force about victims who found strength after impossible situations. He reminded me that justice could be slow, but it did arrive. His steady voice anchored me when my own doubts threatened to pull me under. One evening, we sat on the balcony overlooking the street as the sun dipped low and the sky blushed orange. I asked him why he had always warned me to keep a bag packed. He sipped his coffee and said quietly, "Because I saw the way he looked at you. I saw the way your mother led him. I knew one day you might need to leave fast." His words carried both sorrow and relief. Sorrow that he had been right, relief that I had finally escaped. The investigation pressed forward. Officers collected more statements, neighbors confirmed hearing arguments. The lab confirmed fingerprints and residues. The case was no longer whispers in a kitchen. It was ink on paper, photographs and files, evidence sealed in bags. Each step pulled me further from the image of a girl gasping on the floor and closer to the image of a young woman standing in court with truth behind her. But the voicemails did not stop. My mother's voice turned from pleading to bitter. "You are tearing this family apart," she accused, as though the act of surviving had fractured us instead of the act of harm. Mark's threats sharpened. "You will not get away with this," he growled. Rachel's laughter threaded through every message, still clinging to her false confidence. Each recording made my stomach twist, but each one also strengthened the file Detective Rodriguez built. The day she told me charges were imminent, I felt a surge of both dread and triumph. Dread because court meant facing them again. Triumph because it meant their control was slipping for good. She assured me that protective orders would be in place, that I would not be alone. Her steady eyes met mine, and I believed her. As I walked back to Thomas's apartment that day, the late summer air warm around me, I realized the truth of aftermath. It was not clean. It was messy and heavy with echoes of fear, but within it bloomed the first fragile shoots of independence. I was not only driven out of my old home, I was stepping into a life where my voice mattered, where evidence spoke louder than denial, where allies stood beside me. The family that had once defined me now stood exposed, and I, for the first time, began to define myself. The weeks that followed were not calm. If anything, the storm gathered strength. My family refused to let go of the story they had written about me. Rachel, in particular, escalated her cruelty, as though trying to reclaim control by destroying whatever scraps of my past remained. One evening, the prepaid phone buzzed again, another message waiting. I pressed play, and the screen lit up with another video. This time, the camera panned slowly through the kitchen of our house on Walnut Street. The counters were bare, the cupboards open and empty. Then the camera swung toward the floor, where shards of another glass glittered like jagged ice. Rachel's voice rang out behind the camera, mocking, dripping with satisfaction. "Look at this place," she sneered. "Nothing left for you. You will never come back here." The camera turned on her face, her smirk wide and cruel. "Final warning, wake up." The video cut off abruptly. I felt a tremor of fear course through me, but it was quickly replaced by something sharper. Resolve. She believed she was intimidating me. Instead, she was documenting her own malice. I saved the file carefully and the next morning handed it over to Detective Rodriguez. The detective's eyes narrowed as she watched her pen scratching across the report. "Every move they make strengthens your case," she said. "Keep collecting. Do not delete anything." That advice became my armor. Each voicemail, each text, each video was no longer just another wound. It was evidence. I began cataloging them methodically, labeling dates and times in a small notebook Thomas had given me. My uncle helped me transfer files to a USB drive, his hand steady with the familiarity of years in law enforcement. He reminded me that retaliation often exposes the guilty faster than silence ever could. It was not about answering their threats, but about letting their own words become shackles. Meanwhile, I focused on rebuilding fragments of normal life. I enrolled officially at Lincoln Land Community College, my acceptance letter now a lifeline instead of a secret. I started attending orientation meetings virtually, the laptop balanced on the small table in Thomas's apartment. Every time I clicked join, I felt a piece of freedom grow. Mark had once told me I would not leave until he decided. Now his words sat useless while I charted my own course. But they did not stop. Rachel's next video showed her walking through my old room again, this time holding up a sweater of mine. She pulled at the seams until threads unraveled, then tossed it on the floor with a sneer. "Consider this payback," she said, her eyes gleaming with spite. I should have felt rage, but instead I felt almost calm. Because she did not know I had already taken every important document, every photograph, every piece of identity. She was tearing apart scraps I had already left behind. And with every careless word, she gave the investigation more fuel. Detective Rodriguez called me one afternoon to tell me the digital evidence had been preserved officially. She assured me that the state's attorney would be reviewing charges soon. Her voice carried the weight of certainty. "These things take time," she said, "but the case is strong." I held the phone to my ear, my hands trembling, and realized that for the first time, the future looked like something other than a cycle of abuse. Still, the nights were difficult. I lay awake hearing echoes of Mark's voice, the sneer in Rachel's laughter, my mother's false softness. But then I reminded myself of the files stored safely on the USB. The case file growing on the detective's desk, the protective detail that had been promised. Safety was not perfect, but it was growing around me like walls built from truth. Thomas continued to be my anchor. He drove me to the grocery store, helped me open a small checking account separate from everything Mark had once controlled, and even attended a Sunday service with me at a church near Main Street. The pastor spoke about resilience, about faith forged in fire. And though I had long doubted such words, I found myself listening closely. Perhaps resilience was not about ignoring pain, but about carrying it into evidence, into testimony, into justice. When another voicemail arrived late one night, Thomas sat beside me as I played it. It was Mark this time, his voice low and venomous. "You will pay for this," he growled. "We gave you everything and you threw it back. You think the police will protect you forever." His words slithered through the speaker, but when I looked at Thomas, he did not flinch. "Save it," he said simply. So I did. Each word of Mark's fury became another thread tying him to guilt. The investigation deepened. Officers collected bank statements showing how Mark had funneled my wages into his own account. They photographed the emptied drawers Rachel had flaunted in her video. They documented every digital trace of their harassment. What once felt like scattered shards of suffering now aligned into a pattern too clear to deny. One evening, Detective Rodriguez visited Thomas's apartment with a folder under her arm. She sat at the kitchen table, spread the pages out, and walked me through the case. "Here," she said, pointing to the photographs, "is the glass with his fingerprints. Here is the toxicology report from the hospital. Here are the messages Rachel sent to her friends bragging about teaching you a lesson." Her finger tapped each page like a drumbeat of truth. "The state's attorney is preparing charges. Attempted poisoning, reckless endangerment, destruction of property, harassment." The list felt heavy but just. I leaned back in my chair, my breath trembling as relief washed over me. The years of silence, of gaslighting, of being told I was dramatic were finally unraveling under the weight of evidence. I was no longer just the girl struggling to breathe on a kitchen floor. I was a witness, a survivor, a voice that could not be dismissed. Thomas poured coffee for all of us as the detective packed up her folder. He looked at me over the rim of his mug and said, "You played it smart. You did not answer them. You did not stoop to their level. You let their own words hang them. That is strength." His approval warmed me in a way I had not felt in years. The harassment did not stop immediately, but its power dwindled. Each new message felt less like a threat and more like another stone on the scale of justice. I began to recognize the pattern of abusers clinging to control even as it slipped away. Their desperation became evidence of their defeat. As summer faded into fall, I walked across the campus of Lincoln Land for the first time. My backpack light, but my steps heavy with significance. I had made it. Against the smirks, against the laughter, against the dismissals, I was here. I breathed in the crisp Illinois air and let it fill me with more certainty than any words could provide. In the evenings, I studied at Thomas's table textbooks spread out beside the laptop. Sometimes I caught him watching me with quiet pride, his eyes soft. "You are building something new," he would say. And he was right. Each page I read, each note I wrote, was another brick in the foundation of a life beyond their reach. Yet in the back of my mind, I knew the climax had not yet arrived. Court was coming. The evidence was strong, the files thick, the charges ready. But facing them in that room would be the final test. I could feel the tension coil inside me, fear and strength entwined. For now, though, I held to the truth that their escalation had not broken me. It had armed me, and when the time came to stand before the judge, I would not stand as their victim. I would stand as their undoing. The courthouse in Sangamon County rose gray and solid against the autumn sky, its columns heavy with the weight of decades of judgment. As I stepped from the car, flanked by officers, cameras flashed in rapid bursts, the sound of shutters like a swarm of insects. Reporters called out my name, their voices sharp with questions, but I kept my eyes forward. The click of my shoes on the stone steps echoed louder than their shouts, a rhythm that carried me through the doors into the cool hush of the interior. My uncle walked just behind me, his presence steady, his silence a shield. Inside the courtroom, the air was thick with tension. The benches creaked under the weight of spectators, some curious, some sympathetic, some hungry for scandal. At the front, the judge sat high above Robe's dark gavel, resting on the bench like a silent threat. To my left, the prosecutor arranged papers with meticulous precision, her face calm but eyes sharp. To my right, the defense shuffled nervously. Then the door at the side opened, and my family entered. Mark walked first, his jaw tight, his shoulders squared as if sheer force could hold his world together. Rachel followed, her smirk gone, her eyes darting nervously around the room. My mother trailed behind, her face, pale lips pressed thin, the years of silence now carved into her expression. They sat at the defense table glancing at each other, trying to summon the false confidence that had once ruled our home. But the courtroom was not a kitchen, and their words no longer carried power. The judge called the session to order, his voice steady as a gavel strike. The prosecutor began outlining the charges with clarity. Attempted poisoning, reckless endangerment, harassment, destruction of property. Each word landed heavy, reverberating through the room. She gestured toward me, seated quietly, and then toward the stack of evidence on the table. "We will prove intent," she said firmly. The first piece of evidence was the toxicology report. Dr. Karen Mitchell took the stand, her white coat absent, but her authority intact. She spoke evenly, describing the results: the presence of ethylene glycol in my blood, the timeline of symptoms. She explained how small amounts could be lethal, how the traces in my system matched the residue found in the glass and container recovered from the Dawson kitchen. The jury listened intently, their eyes widening as the science unfolded. The defense tried to suggest contamination, but her firm shake of the head silenced the attempt. "Contamination is impossible in this case," she said. "The match is clear." Next came Jason Miller, the EMT, whose hands had steadied me that night. He described finding me on the floor, my lips blue, my pulse weak. He detailed how he had collected evidence discreetly because the scene raised immediate suspicion. When the prosecutor asked if my life had been in danger, his answer was immediate. "Yes, minutes away." His voice carried the weight of truth, unshakable, undeniable. The officer who had responded testified next, describing how he had received the evidence bag, how he had observed the family's reactions, how he had requested protective custody on the spot. His words painted a picture of urgency of a scene that bore all the marks of deliberate harm. The jury leaned forward, their faces sober. Then the videos and voicemails were played. Rachel's sneer filled the courtroom as the screen displayed her destroying my belongings, her words dripping with malice. "Consider this your final wake-up call." The jurors shifted uncomfortably, some glancing at her where she sat pale and rigid. The voicemails echoed through the room, Mark's threats low and venomous, my mother's dismissals thin and brittle. Each word stripped away their defense, each recording another nail in the coffin of their lies. The defense attorney attempted to argue that Rachel had been joking, that Mark's threats were simply frustration, that my mother's words were those of concern twisted out of context. But the jury had seen the videos, had heard the tones, had watched the professionals testify. No amount of spin could erase what was plain. Finally, I was called to the stand. My heart pounded as I rose, the weight of every eye on me. But as I sat and took the oath, I felt something stronger than fear. I felt clarity. I told them what I remembered: the bitter taste of the water, the collapse on the kitchen floor, Mark's smirk, Rachel's laughter, my mother's silence. I described the fear that had wrapped around my lungs, the way my vision darkened the moment I thought my heart had stopped. My voice trembled but did not break. I looked at the jurors, letting them see not just a victim, but a survivor who had chosen to speak. The prosecutor guided me gently, never pushing, letting my truth stand on its own. When she asked how I felt when Jason placed the mask on my face, I answered honestly. For the first time, I felt believed. That word hung in the air, heavy with meaning. The defense attorney tried to rattle me, suggesting I had exaggerated, that perhaps I had mistaken the taste, that stress had clouded my memory. I met his gaze steadily and repeated what I knew. I drank water from the glass my mother handed me. Minutes later, I could not breathe. The tests confirmed it. His questions faltered, his voice losing strength. When closing arguments arrived, the prosecutor stood tall, her voice ringing with conviction. She spoke of evidence, of fingerprints, of toxicology, of digital admissions. She reminded the jury that this was not about family squabbles, but about deliberate harm. She pointed toward me. This young woman survived not because of her family, but despite them. Do not let their denial erase what the truth has revealed. Her words ignited the room with clarity. The defense attempted to plead for leniency, painting Mark as a frustrated father, Rachel as a misguided sibling, Linda as a confused mother. But the evidence towered above such words, and the jury's expressions were unreadable but firm. The judge instructed the jury, and they filed out. The room buzzed with tension, every breath held. I sat rigid, my uncle's hand steady on my shoulder. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Then the door opened and the jury returned. Faces, solemn, steps steady. The foreman stood, paper in hand. On the charge of attempted poisoning, guilty. On the charge of reckless endangerment, guilty. On the charge of harassment and destruction of property, guilty. The words fell like stones into a still pond, sending ripples through the courtroom. Gasps erupted from the gallery. My mother buried her face in her hands. Rachel shook her head, whispering no over and over. Mark's jaw clenched so hard his teeth might have cracked, but his eyes betrayed the first flicker of fear I had ever seen in him. The judge's gavel struck once, sealing the verdict into history. Sentencing would come later, but immediate no-contact orders were issued. They were forbidden from approaching me, from calling, from writing. The chains they had wrapped around me for years shattered in that moment. I exhaled slowly, my chest rising without strain, my lungs full of air that belonged only to me. As I stepped out of the courtroom, cameras flashed again, reporters shouted, but I did not answer. I simply walked down the courthouse steps, my breath steady, my steps sure. The October wind brushed against my face, and for the first time in years, I inhaled deeply without fear. Justice had spoken not in whispers, not in denials, but in verdicts. The story they had told about me collapsed in public view, and I walked forward free. News travels fast in Springfield, and within 24 hours of the verdict, headlines appeared on every local feed. The State Journal-Register ran the story across its front page, the headline stark against the gray print "Springfield man guilty in stepdaughter poisoning attempt." The article detailed the charges, the evidence, and the courtroom drama. It did not soften the facts, did not bury the details under euphemism. Mark Dawson, a garage manager once known for his booming laugh at neighborhood barbecues, was now known for attempted poisoning. Rachel Dawson, once the smiling young woman snapping selfies at the mall, was now branded an accomplice to harassment. Linda Dawson, a nurse who had prided herself on her steady hands, was revealed as a mother who looked away when her child was in danger. The story spread beyond Springfield, picked up by regional outlets shared across social media, dissected by strangers who did not know me but spoke my name with outrage or sympathy. For years, their voices had drowned out mine. Now, strangers were speaking louder than they ever had. Mark lost his job within days, the auto shop issuing a statement about safety and trust. Rachel's college friends pulled back embarrassed by the headlines, her social media pages flooded with comments ranging from shock to fury. Linda took leave from the hospital where she worked, whispers following her through the halls. The foundation they had built their reputations on crumbled in public view, every brick loosened by their own choices. For me, the aftermath was not immediate joy. It was something quieter, steadier, like learning to walk again after years of crawling. When I stepped out of the courthouse that day, I felt the October air fill my lungs in a way that was almost foreign. I returned to Peoria with Thomas and for the first time allowed myself to sleep deeply without waking in a panic. The nightmares came less often, and when they did, I could remind myself of the gavel strike, the guilty verdict, the no-contact orders that were more than paper. They were a wall between me and the house that had once held my breath hostage. The community's reaction surprised me. Letters arrived at Thomas's apartment addressed simply to me. Some were from neighbors who confessed they had suspected but never known how to intervene. Some were from strangers in nearby towns, women who had escaped their own toxic families, men who had seen abuse silenced in their homes. Each letter reminded me I was not alone, that my story was not singular but part of a wider truth people were finally willing to name. I returned briefly to Springfield under police escort to collect the few belongings I wanted. The house on Walnut Street was no longer the same. Yellow tape fluttered faintly at the edges of the yard, the windows dark, the air heavy with emptiness. Inside, the rooms felt smaller, the walls thinner, the kitchen colder. I walked through slowly, my footsteps echoing my fingers grazing the table where I had nearly collapsed. It was not a home. It was a crime scene. I gathered the last of my books, a framed photo of my father from years before, and left without looking back. As the door clicked shut, I knew it was the final time I would cross that threshold. Back in Peoria, I began to build something new. I enrolled full-time in classes balancing coursework with part-time shifts at a local cafe, where the owner offered me extra hours with no questions asked. Each paycheck felt like proof that I could support myself without their shadow looming. I decorated the small apartment Thomas had helped me secure with second-hand furniture and bright curtains. It was not large, but it was mine. No slammed doors, no mocking laughter, no footsteps stalking down a hallway. Just quiet, the good kind, filled with the sound of my own breathing. The calls and messages stopped after the verdict. For a while, the silence felt eerie, as though waiting for another shoe to drop. But gradually, I realized it was not emptiness, but space. Space to think, to plan to live without fear. One evening, I stood at the window overlooking Main Street, the lights glowing warm against the early winter dusk, and I allowed myself to imagine 5 years ahead. A degree, a career, a life defined not by survival, but by choice. The thought filled me with a steadier kind of hope than I had ever known. Yet closure came in a moment I did not expect. Weeks after the trial, I dialed Rachel's voicemail. My hands did not tremble. My voice did not shake. I left a single sentence calm and measured. Turns out, I was fine after all. Then I hung up, not waiting for a response, not needing one. The words were not revenge. They were a reminder. A reminder that despite their attempts, despite their smirks and denials, I was still here, breathing, living, moving forward. The public consequences continued to ripple. Springfield's community forums buzzed with debate. Some called for stricter oversight of domestic abuse cases, pointing to my survival as proof of systemic failures and the need for vigilance. Others whispered about the signs they had missed, the laughter they had excused, the smirk they had shrugged off. I heard about these conversations from Thomas, who read the articles out loud, his voice carrying both pride and sorrow. Pride that the truth was out. Sorrow that it had taken nearly losing me for anyone to listen. At Lincoln Land, professors encouraged me quietly aware of the trial, but respectful of my privacy. Classmates offered silent nods, subtle gestures of support that meant more than grand speeches. I studied late into the night, pages filled with notes determined to make the most of the chance I had nearly been robbed of. The bitterness that had once clung to my throat was replaced by the steady rhythm of learning, of planning, of dreaming. Mark, Rachel, and Linda faded into the background of my life, not gone, but powerless. Their names were now tied to court documents and news articles, their reputations fractured. Whenever their faces appeared on local news segments, I turned the volume down. They no longer deserved my attention. My story was no longer theirs to twist. In the quiet of my apartment, I reflected on the lessons carved into me by survival. Gaslighting can silence, but it cannot erase the truth. Cruelty may laugh, but it always leaves traces. Silence is not weakness when it is used to gather evidence to build a case, to let facts speak louder than shouts. Justice does not always roar. Sometimes it arrives in steady steps in photographs and verdicts, in the calm voice of an EMT refusing to look away. Closure was not the absence of pain, but the presence of perspective. I would always remember the cold floor of the kitchen, the smirk on Mark's face, the laughter in Rachel's voice, the silence from my mother. But I would also remember the hiss of oxygen filling my lungs, the steady hand of Jason Miller, the firm voice of Detective Rodriguez, the unwavering support of Thomas. Those memories balanced the scales. They reminded me that while betrayal cuts deepest when it comes from family, healing can come from unexpected places too. The public might remember the story as a headline, a trial, a scandal. For me, it was the turning point of my life. The moment I stopped being the girl mocked for pain and became the woman who survived, who spoke, who reclaimed breath and voice. And as I stood one evening on the balcony of my apartment in Peoria, watching the winter snow begin to fall, I whispered to myself the simplest truth. I was free. When I look back now, I realize that survival is not just a single moment of breathing again on a kitchen floor or hearing a gavel strike in a courtroom. Survival is a long road paved with small decisions, some born out of desperation, some out of hope, some out of sheer refusal to give up. It is the act of continuing even when every voice around you insists you are dramatic, weak, or unworthy of belief. For years, I lived in that fog where truth was twisted into lies and lies were presented as truth. I was told that my pain was exaggerated, that my fear was childish, that my worth was conditional on obedience. What I did not know then but understand now is that silence does not mean weakness. Silence can be strategy. Silence can be the space where strength grows quietly until the right moment arrives to speak not with anger that fades, but with evidence that endures. I learned the hard way that family is not always defined by love or protection. Sometimes family is defined by control, by jealousy, by resentment. The people who should have guarded my life were the ones who placed it in danger. My stepfather smirked while I gasped for breath. My stepsister laughed when my body crumpled. My mother turned away her silence louder than any scream. The betrayal of family cuts deeper than any wound a stranger could cause. But the truth is that betrayal does not end you. It reveals you. It shows you who you are when stripped of comfort, when faced with the choice to either accept their version of your story or fight for your own. The night I nearly lost my life on the kitchen floor taught me to trust instinct. That bitter taste on my tongue, that strange heaviness in my chest, those were signs I could have dismissed. I could have told myself not to make a fuss, to endure quietly to believe their lies. But my body knew, and by listening to that inner alarm, I gave myself a chance to survive. If there is one lesson I would share with anyone who has ever doubted their own feelings, it is this: listen. Your body whispers truths your mind may try to deny. Do not ignore the taste, the ache, the unease. Those small signals can save your life. I also learned that justice does not always arrive with thunder or applause. Sometimes it arrives in quiet persistence. In the EMT, who refused to look away, who placed evidence in a bag when others dismissed my gasps as theatrics. In the officer who asked if I felt safe going home, a question that broke through years of assumed danger. In the doctor who let the numbers speak louder than excuses. In the detective who built a case brick by brick from the fragments of my pain. Their work did not roar. It hummed steadily, persistently, until the walls of denial crumbled. And when the verdict was read, it was not just a legal conclusion. It was a declaration that truth had triumphed over lies. To those who are older, who may have lived through decades of family expectations and social silences, you know how heavy the weight of appearance can be. You know the pressure to keep peace, to smooth over cruelty, to tell yourself that enduring is the noble choice. But I stand here as proof that silence does not protect anyone. It protects the abuser, the controller, the one who laughs at pain. Speaking, documenting, trusting yourself, those are not betrayals of family. They are acts of survival. And survival is the foundation of any future worth building. I think often of my mother, of the way she looked at me in that kitchen, her phone still in her hand, her voice repeating the lie that I was fine. I used to ache for her love, used to twist myself into knots to win her approval. But I have come to see that her silence was her choice. She chose fear of conflict over protection of her child. She chose comfort in Mark's shadow over truth in my voice. That is her legacy, not mine. My legacy is the breath I draw now without permission, the education I pursue, the life I build beyond her reach. Sometimes the hardest lesson is that not every mother protects, but that realization does not mean you are unworthy of protection. It means you must seek it elsewhere, build it yourself, and accept it from those willing to give it freely. I think of Rachel, too. The sister who mocked me, who recorded my gasps, who sent videos of destruction. She believed cruelty was power, that laughter was proof of superiority. But every video she sent became evidence. Every word she spat became another thread in the case against her. She taught me that cruelty always leaves a trail, that those who gloat eventually expose themselves. In trying to erase me, she etched my survival into record. And Mark, the man who stood over me with a smirk while I struggled for breath, his legacy is now written in headlines and court documents. He believed control was eternal, that intimidation would silence me forever. But power built on fear crumbles when faced with truth. His downfall was not dramatic. It was steady, inevitable, as each piece of evidence stacked against him. He is no longer the man whose voice defined the house. He is the man whose fingerprints marked a container of poison. That is how history will remember him. What stays with me most, though, is the support that came when I least expected it. My Uncle Thomas, who once warned me to keep a bag packed, stepped in with quiet strength. He gave me keys, shelter, and the kind of steady presence I had never known. Jason, the EMT, who looked at me not as a dramatic teenager, but as a patient whose life mattered. Detective Rodriguez, who turned my scattered fragments into a case that could stand in court. These people were not bound to me by blood, but by choice. And their choice to believe me, to protect me, to fight for me is what family should truly mean. To anyone listening who has ever been mocked when they cried out, who has ever been told they were overreacting when they were in pain, who has ever been silenced in the name of peace, know this: your truth matters. You do not owe explanations to those who choose not to see your pain. Protect yourself. Document everything. Seek allies. And when the time comes, let the truth speak for itself. Justice may not arrive in fireworks, but in steady steps, in quiet voices that refuse to bend in verdicts that cannot be erased. Sometimes I replay the moment I left the hospital, the sight of my mother and sister standing behind police tape, their faces twisted in rage. I did not wave. I did not speak. I turned away. That image stays with me not as a wound, but as a symbol. They were trapped behind the tape of their own choices, and I was free to walk forward. Freedom is not always about distance. Sometimes it is about refusing to turn back. Today, I live in a small apartment in Peoria. The walls are painted soft yellow, the curtains catch the morning light, the shelves hold books of my choosing. It is not grand, but it is mine. At night, I sit by the window and breathe deeply, no longer waiting for footsteps or smirks or laughter. Just breathing steady and unafraid. That is what survival looks like. Not dramatic, not loud, but steady, daily, undeniable. To the generation older than me, to those who have carried decades of silence, I know how hard it can be to speak. I know how ingrained it is to endure. But I hope my story reminds you that it is never too late to choose truth, to protect yourself, to draw boundaries, to refuse to let cruelty masquerade as love. You are not obligated to carry pain to preserve appearances. You are allowed to be free. In the end, my story is not just about poisoning or courtrooms or headlines. It is about reclaiming the simplest human act, breathing without fear. It is about refusing to let others dictate the terms of your life. It is about finding family in those who choose to stand with you, not just those tied by blood. And it is about knowing that even when betrayal feels like it has taken everything, it cannot take your voice unless you give it away. I survived. I spoke. I reclaimed. And now I live.